Chapter 3. Against the skeleton's wishes, Ferris hadn't slept at all well. Her mind was too busy to shut down, and she was too annoyed to put it at ease. More than all of the information the young monster had dumped on her the previous day, his calm control over the situation got to her. She didn't like it. As right as it might have been to follow him for now, she didn't like the idea of giving in to him and his guild. Nevertheless, by the time the sun rose, she didn't see any other option. The skeleton had made it clear that he'd take her with him and she didn't have the power to fight him. More importantly, since he wanted her alive and knew what she was capable of, he'd prioritize her safety so she couldn't jump to the past and avoid meeting him altogether. If there was one advantage Ferris did have over him, it's that he never talked about the golden stars. He said that some people could track her leaps through time, but he never mentioned to anyone knowing when and where she saved her place in it. Even if it took a while longer, she could hold off on saving until she made her decision, whether it was better to stick with him or escape. Human lives were very fragile after all. He couldn't protect her from everything. Even right then, she had her dagger. Making the skeleton eat his own words would be so easy. Not yet, though. She could be patient until the future ahead was more certain. Besides, from previous experience, it wasn't like that was a fun way to go either. There were quicker and easier means out there. Ferris recited the plan in her head, proud of her own cleverness, as she got Kira and herself ready to move. She tied back her sister's medium brown hair in its usual ponytail, fondly running her fingers through to comb it. A soft smile traced her lips. Half a year ago, her darker locks had been just as long. However, she'd had to chop it off, a poor cut that ran in an obvious slant at her shoulders. It only made sense that it had to go, since it had been a hassle to take care of, and one more thing for someone to grab in a fight. Still, she would have been lying if she said she didn't miss it at least a little bit. At least Kira got to keep her beautiful hair that was the same as their mother's. It would have been a shame if Ferris had to cut hers off as well. When the task was done, Kira glanced back at her worriedly. "Do we have to go with him?" The little girl had time to adjust, but Kira was nervous around any monster. Rightfully so, given their history, but she had to put an end to that bias at some point. Of course, they had their reasons for not trusting this monster in particular as well. Ferris tapped her lips with a forefinger, giving her sibling a sly wink. For now, anyway. "Just listen to your big sis. We're gonna be just fine." She'd see to it that they'd be just fine. The gate hadn't been cleared. Instead, the skeleton rounded everybody along the base of the nearby wall when he was ready for them. Packed down with their worn clothes and looted goods, the captives were as ragtag a group as anyone would ever see. They waited in a misshapen cluster as their terrifying rescuer continued to look for his partner's arrival, which took about another half hour. When the sun had half fully risen over the distant mountains, he called for them at last. "On your feet, all of you! Climb the turret and get into pairs. Once you're up here, I'll use my magic to get you down to the other side of the wall." They obeyed. Even if there was any other option, the skeleton's commanding demeanor was impossible for most of them to ignore. Kira hugged close to Ferris as they moved up the turret's stone steps, and soon found themselves back out into the open air a few meters above where they'd been standing a minute earlier. A lonely cart was parked directly outside of the fort. It didn't take Ferris long to realize it was actually another monster. Although there was no horse or driver, the front wheels moved on their own, shifting in place in a way that reminded her of an ordinary person wringing their hands or rocking from foot to foot. As she craned her neck for a better view, she could have sworn she spotted black hair poking out from under the driver's seat like a thick mustache. The first prisoner in line was a young girl about Kira's age, a hybrid with slitted eyes and almost reptilian skin. The child was so scared that she practically shivered in place. A blanket was tied across her shoulders like an improvised knapsack, and she clung its large knot against her chest like a lifeline without daring raise her eyes at the skeletons. He looked at her with an uninterested expression, raising his hands, palms up, in a calculated movement. A deep blue glow emanated from her chest and that of the green-eyed young man beside her. In an instant, they were lifted into the air and over the wall. She cried out, staring at the ground below, and the boy reached out for her hand to pacify her as they were slowly taken down. Those watching held their breath until the pair had safely landed. A few cheered. Again, Ferris found herself having to give the skeleton a bit of credit. Although he could move faster, he was being considerately careful to keep anyone from panicking. Still, for Kira, his efforts were in vain. She hung onto Ferris so tightly, it was almost as if she was trying to squeeze her sister's organs out. Ferris rubbed her sibling's arm to comfort her, telling her in a low voice, "Just keep holding on to me." They continued that routine just as they were ordered, stepping up 2 by 2 for the monster to telekinetically lower them out of the fort. Away from its oppressing walls, the more of the prisoners he carried down, the more relaxed the group became. Unnerved silence turned into teary eyes and excited chatter as the sight of freedom, and possibly home, became clearer by the second. Soon enough, it was the two sisters' turn. As she felt the skeleton's magic grip her soul, Ferris raised a brow at how odd it felt. Actually, she'd been thrown by blue magic once before, but the mage that had used it on her that time had meant to hurt her. His magic was so intense that it felt like he'd torn his hand right through her body to grab at her insides. The skeleton's hold was noticeably firm, but not painful, and only overly tight long enough to send her a message. Don't think of trying to run off. They shared a look that confirmed the silent demand, and she scowled at him, wrapping her arms further around Kira as they were lifted up and out. A moment later, they touched dirt and his magic left them. Her sister continued to hang on to her for several minutes after that. Wasn't it exhausting to move so many people with magic? If it was, the skeleton didn't show it. Soon enough, the last of the captives joined them, and he lowered himself down last. He only just started walking toward the sisters when a thin pair of arms stopped him from behind. Dark sockets widened as a small boy, who couldn't have been any older than 4, sniveled against his back.
"Thank you."
Someone started clapping. Others followed, true relief finally radiating from the crowd now that it was all but certain that they were saved. It was a scene straight out of a minstrel's song, the young mages in awe of their unexpected hero who asked nothing of them in return. Except for Ferris and Kira. The older sister covered her mouth with her hand to hide back a laugh at the skeleton's dumbstruck face and stiff posture. He asked for nothing because they had nothing he wanted. It was as simple as that. His only goal was to get a powerful seer. Any thanks was wasted on him. Trying to play nice and take all that praise like he was some kind of savior must have been hard on him. Recomposing himself, the skeleton casually pulled the child away to give one last set of commands. "All right, enough!" He pointed to the vehicle, who raised a handle in greeting and once more scared the young mages who hadn't figured out what he was until then. "This is Carter. He can carry those of you going to Longkeld. Everyone else, you're on your own from here. I have to lead Miss Ferris elsewhere, so this is where we say goodbye." Miss Ferris, huh? She might have gotten another chuckle out of that if he wasn't so irritating. She doubted he'd keep up that polite attitude after the others were gone. She didn't certainly plan on using any formalities. "Carter's trustworthy, so don't worry. And he knows the land. He's used to ferrying goods around Ebott. You'll get to town safely." He didn't need to reassure them. It was unlikely that many of them knew how they got to the fort when they'd been kidnapped, and they were surrounded by wilderness as far as the eye could see. Besides themselves, almost everyone else climbed on board and settled down for a long ride. The 4 people that didn't were a party that agreed to travel together in the opposite direction, with the hopes of leaving Ebott entirely. It wasn't a smart move. At least mages were wanted in Ebott. They were feared at best outside its borders. However, since magic wasn't as well understood in other lands, few would pay attention to their eyes. So long as they kept their abilities hidden, they would blend in perfectly. After another series of useless thank yous, Ferris's own sudden party watched them leave. Soon enough, both a cart full of young mages and much smaller group of sure-footed refugees were out of sight. She and the skeleton turned to each other, then he waved a gloved hand for her and Kira to follow. Just for the sake of testing his patience, Ferris held her ground a moment longer, folding her arms across her chest. "You know, I just remembered that we never got your name. You already know mine, so it's only fair that I know yours." He stopped in his tracks, shooting her a glare. Good. He understood she had no intention of making the trip easy for him. Nevertheless, with a deep sigh, he answered, "Castellar."